Recording. All right. So that was the teaser. So if Daniel's 2nd century dated, that means it's a fraudulent book. So what I did, this one has an interesting connection. I need to give it to you in a short form. This is one of the few books in the Bible that had an early critic from around 300 AD. So Daniel's rocking along. It was accepted. It was part of scripture, assembled into the canon, various councils. They all meet together. They go, no, this is a valid book. Everything's good. And then along comes this guy in 300 AD. He lived from 234 to like 304, 305, something like that. His name was Porphyry of Tyre. Right? We already discussed Tyre. Porphyry of Tyre was a Neoplatonic philosopher, and he had, now listen, I'm just telling you, he has a built-in bias. This man was not objective. How do I know that? He published not a 1-volume, not a 2-volume, not a 5-volume, a 15-volume work called Against the Christians. This was in like 300 AD. 15-volume work called Against the Christians, which the point of all those books was to try to discredit Jewish and Christian prophecy. He claimed Daniel's visions were written by somebody who lived in Judea, never in Babylon, much later during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so instead of predicting the future, the writer was describing something that has already happened. Now, Porphyry of Tyre, his work was never widely accepted, nor did it really even cause a ripple in the pond of Daniel being accepted as a valid book of the Bible. As a matter of fact, Jerome, who lived about 100 years later than he did, Jerome wrote something called the Commentary, and I'm sure you've heard of Jerome before. He wrote the Commentary of Daniel in 407 AD, and he thoroughly just shredded all of Porphyry of Tyre's arguments. So, and there it lay for 1400 years. Now, cue bell, bring in these German, and I'm not knocking the Germans while my wife's German, so got to be careful. German liberal revisionists, that's just where that movement started. It spread all over the world to England. It was France and then England, and then even in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, this school of liberal revisionists somehow picked up on Porphyry of Tyre's arguments. Dead for 1400 years and buried and not considered credible, and they started building upon his arguments, so that they made 8 what they viewed were credible arguments. And this happened about over a 100-year period between the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s. So about a 100-year period of time, they made these 8 persuasive arguments why Daniel, it was not written in the 6th century, is a fraudulent book written in the 2nd century, should not be in the canon of scripture. Now, I will tell you that 3 out of the 8 arguments have been completely reversed because, and I will give you the arguments and the rebuttals, 3 of the 8 have been completely reversed by archaeological discoveries in the last 50 to 75 years, and are now our arguments for a 6th century dating instead of against. 2 of the arguments are called arguments from conclusion, and you'll see why I can't really rebut them, but you'll see the flaw in their logic in arguing from such a stance. One of the arguments, I have an explanation, but I have no clear-cut definitive proof against it. So let's go. I'm going to give you the 8 arguments in quick-fire fashion, and then I'm going to try to outline the rebuttals. Here we go. Argument number 1, Daniel contains historical inaccuracies concerning 6th century kings and events. Argument number 2, half of Daniel was written in Aramaic. a language that the Jews spoke during a later period, much later than 6th century BC. Also, Daniel 3 contains 3 Greek words, and the Greeks really didn't become a presence until after Alexander the Great overran everything about 250 years later. Bullet point 3, Daniel's predictions of the future are too accurate to be authentic. Therefore, the books must have been written after the fact. I make that up. I don't make that up. That is an argument. 4, apocalyptic literature, which is a style of literature that Daniel certainly is apocalyptic literature, didn't flourish until after 200 BC, so it must have been written later. Bullet point 5, a Jewish historian, Jesus ben Sirach, who lived about 180 BC, he mentioned a bunch of famous Jewish people in his writings, but he never mentioned Daniel. So therefore, it must be a fake book. Must not have existed at the time. Bullet point 6, Belshazzar is called king of Babylon in Daniel 5, and he wasn't the actual king. Bullet point 6, Darius the Mede, which Daniel mentions in chapters 5 and 6, is not known to history. And number 8, which is kind of like number 3, the stories of Nebuchadnezzar's insanity, the fiery furnace, etc., 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 these miraculous stories are far-fetched miracle stories that were common in later Jewish texts. Later, these type of writings didn't occur in the 6th century, occurred much later, and they're too fantastical, too miraculous to be true. So here we go. Rebuttals. We may run a little long today, guys. I'm trying to talk fast. You all right with that? All right. First of all, historical inaccuracies. Here's the first one. And this was actually a very strong point of theirs for almost 50 years until archaeology came to the rescue. In Daniel, in the very first verse of Daniel reads, in the 3rd year, what did I say? 3rd year. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now they go, oh, look, that's a problem, because Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 46:2 that the invasion, the assault, happened in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. Well, there you go, case closed. By the way, this inconsistency, or what looks to be an inconsistency, is also when you read these books or these articles about why the Bible isn't trustworthy or contradictions within the Bible, this is one of the ones they will frequently mention. So what's the explanation? Is there an explanation? Yes. Thankfully, archaeology came to the rescue with this. This is exactly correct, exactly the way it's written. Why? How does that work? One says 3rd year, the other one says 4th year. How does that work? Where did Jeremiah live? He lived in Israel. Where did Daniel live? Where did he grow up? Where did he spend his whole life? Babylon. Now, it took a while, but they discovered that none of the dates, when you would compare Palestinian Egyptian reckoning of time, would ever match up with Babylonian records. Why? Especially when it relates to a king. Well, what they came to realize is the way Babylonians count time as it concerns a king is different from the way the Egyptians, Palestinians counted time. What's the difference? Palestinians and Egyptians count the months between when he comes to the throne and the 1st year, the new year, as 1 year. Whereas the Babylonians dismiss that less than a year period and only count from the start of the new year after he takes the throne. So let's say Jehoiakim came to power in October of the year. The Jews and the Egyptians would reckon that 1st year to be the time between October and December. That's year 1. And beginning in January starts year 2. The way a Babylonian would count time is they dismiss the October, November, December period and begin counting from when the new year starts in January. So this actually was one of the arguments I mentioned earlier that was turned on its head and is now one of those aha moments that Daniel was actually, nobody would have known that unless you had current archaeological discoveries, unless you lived at the time. Daniel lived basically most of his entire life as a Babylonian court officer, as an elite in Babylon, even though he was a Jew. So everything he did, he spoke, he counted, he did everything as a Babylonian. All his culture was Babylonian. He was even given a Babylonian name. We call him by his Hebrew name, but he was even given a Babylonian name. So when he said it was the 4th year in the reign of Jehoiakim, when Jeremiah said that, that's exactly correct. And it's exactly 3 years as a Babylonian would count it, end of story. That argument no longer exists. That was one of the original 8 arguments the liberal revisionists used to get secular media to overturn the dating of Daniel. I think I'll hold questions to the end. So if you have notes or a way to write notes, if you have a question about a specific bullet point, please jot it down so you don't forget it, and we'll come back to it. Bullet point 2. Half of Daniel is written in Aramaic, and Aramaic wasn't commonly used until around the 2nd century BC, much later. Again, that looked like a very strong argument. It was about a strong argument for almost 75 years, this particular one. By the way, we don't know why Daniel was half written in Aramaic. I have no idea. Don't ask me what the other half was written in, because I forgot and I didn't write it in my notes. So if any of you smarty pants ask me that, I'll have to get back to you. But half the book of Daniel is written in Aramaic. So this was a pretty strong argument for years. Again, archaeology comes to the rescue. It turns out, again, more digs, more tablets, more cuneiforms, more pottery. Daniel is written in a form of Aramaic that they didn't even know existed. It's called Imperial Aramaic. It's an extremely formalized version of Aramaic. The scholars from the 1800s were correct. The Aramaic that they were thinking of, the common or colloquial Aramaic, didn't even exist and was not widely used until the 2nd century BC. But Imperial Aramaic was actually the language of court officers. If you were writing correspondence, an official document, you would always write the document in Imperial Aramaic. It was the official language or the standard language of the Far East in the 7th and 6th century BC going forward. So any court under Babylonian influence or any court under Aramaic influence, a court document would be written in this highly formalized or imperial Aramaic. So it turns out, again, this argument was flipped on its head and is now a supporting argument for the 6th century dating of Daniel, because there's no way somebody would have known to have faked that, because again, this is something that we've only recently discovered. When I say recently, in the last 50 to 75 years, that there were actually 2 different forms of Aramaic. All right, moving on. Next issue. Also a language issue. It's part of objection number 2. Is what about the Greek words? There's some Greek words in Daniel, and people find that odd. They're actually, there's only 3 Greek words in there, and they relate to musical instruments in the book of Daniel. So this is not an argument that hasn't been turned necessarily in defense of a 6th century dating, but it's just become a non-argument with recent discoveries. So they have now found that the Greeks had influence way back as early as the 7th or 8th century BC. They weren't restricted just to the 3rd century BC and beyond. They actually had further back influence, especially the Greek poets and musicians were highly renowned through the known world at that time. So for Daniel to contain 3 Greek words, especially as they related to musical instruments, is not unusual like the 1800 scholars thought they were. So this is an argument that once was very strong, Greek words appearing, and now is not strong at all. As a matter of fact, it has become a non-argument for the 2nd century dating of the book of Daniel. There's one other thing that scholars like to point out that are on the conservative side, is that if Daniel was a fraudulent book written in the 2nd century BC, then the whole Bloomin' book would have probably been written in Greek, not just 3 words. Because by that time, the known world in the 2nd century BC, after Alexander's conquests, the whole world, the known world, had been Hellenized. It had been turned entirely Greek. And Greek was the 100% de facto dominant culture. You would not have a document written half in Aramaic, half in something else, and only 3 Greek words in it. So this has become a complete non-argument, and that was argument number 2. Argument number 3 and 8, I'm going to lump together because these are called arguments from a conclusion. And I'm just reading this to you from the arguments of the liberal revisionists who say Daniel's a fraud. The fact that Daniel is so accurate, like other prophetic books, means it cannot be dated when it says it's going to be dated. Now, this is called, if you're in a junior high school debate team, this is called an argument from a conclusion. You make a conclusion first, and then you try to make the facts fit or discredit or accept something based on a conclusion that you've already arrived at beforehand. So this isn't really a logical criticism of the book of Daniel. It's mere a statement of opinion. We do not believe in miracles. We do not believe in prophecies. Therefore, the book has to be fake on both counts. Now, this is also bullet point 8. Bullet point 8 is the miracles of Daniel are outside the ability of history or archaeology to prove. So therefore, the book of Daniel cannot be genuine. Now, using that line of reasoning, again, they would not have a problem with this, and secular historians wouldn't have a problem, but evangelical Christians are going to have a problem with where this is going. This means that basically every book in the Bible, every book of prophecy, every Acts, all the Gospels, the book of Revelation, I pretty much discount every book in the Bible with the exception of maybe storytelling books like Ruth or Esther, you cannot accept as genuine books of the Bible because they all contain miracles. How are you going to believe the virgin birth of Jesus and the resurrection of Christ if you discount the ability for miracles to occur, for prophecies to actually be accepted as possible? So arguments 2 and 3 and 8 are actually not really arguments. They're statements of opinion. And so I will treat them as thus. You will never win. You couldn't win a junior high school debate class with an argument from conclusion because it's a flawed logic to begin with. You're not proving anything. You're just stating your opinion and then making decisions based on that opinion. And the point of healthy debate, of good interaction, is present your case, I'll present counter, let me present my case, you present counter, we try to come to some kind of acceptance or conclusion. But this is not, it's not either. Items 3 and 8 do not do that either. Argument 4. Again, very good argument for years. It has a flawed logic. This one has not been overturned due to archaeology. It just has a logic flaw to it, which I will point out. It doesn't completely dismiss the argument, but it definitely makes it weaker. So here's the argument. The book of Daniel is a style of writing called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature was not commonplace and widespread until 200 BC to 100 AD. So about a 300-year period, apocalyptic literature was in style. It was the thing to do. And therefore, Daniel cannot be dated to 6th century BC from 500 BC or whatever, because it's apocalyptic literature, and that wasn't widely accepted till years later. I think you can see the problem with that line of thinking or with that logic is it could very well be wrong. It makes a huge assumption. And here's the assumption. It's called an argument of origin. In order for something to become widespread in the ancient world, you didn't have internet, you didn't have Zoom, you didn't have the newspaper, and you didn't have interstates. Copies of things would have to be handwritten and then hand distributed by foot, by horse, by ship. But this caused things to spread very slowly in the ancient world. Why is that an issue? Well, if apocalyptic literature had, by their own admission, by the liberal revisionists, had been made popular and widespread by 200 BC, that means Daniel had, if Daniel is a prototype literature, it could very well have been dated long before then. The reason I say that is there's many things about apocalyptic literature that seem to mimic Daniel. Now, you could come back and say Daniel was merely mimicking other apocalyptic literature, but for apocalyptic literature to become widespread, there had to be a prototype. There had to be an origin. There had to be a seed. What was the seed? We don't know. A conservative biblical scholar would tell you Daniel was in fact the seed for all apocalyptic literature, and you would need a period of roughly 200 to 300 years for that literature to get spread around enough, to become widespread enough, to become copied enough, to become commonplace and widespread by 200 BC. So this weakens the argument, but it doesn't, like the other bullet points, it doesn't dismiss or reverse the argument. Daniel is a style of apocalyptic literature. If it was copied and not the origin, then this gives argument to the liberal revisionists to date it later than the 6th century BC. A conservative scholar would say, but we don't know that it wasn't the origin piece. It claims to be the origin piece, and unless you can prove that it isn't the origin piece, that would fit about the time frame that it would need to be produced, copied, and become widespread enough to where by 200 BC, it would become a style of literature commonly used. So I'm going to call this one a draw because it's not conclusive either way. Argument number 5. There was a Jewish historian. He lived about 100 BC, and his name was Jesus ben Sirach. And he wrote a historical document, which they have copies of or fragments of copies of. And he does not list Daniel. And so the liberal revisionists will point to this and say, okay, Daniel's missing from his list, therefore Daniel is a fraud. Actually, there's a rather lengthy list of people that we know were actual Jewish historical figures that Jesus ben Sirach does not list. One that's in the Bible is Ezra, but there's other historical figures that he simply doesn't list or we haven't found yet. So I'm going to call this one a weak argument, not a strong argument for the liberal revisionists, because the fact that he's not in there doesn't prove anything, because there's quite a few people that we know existed for sure that were historical figures, not biblical figures, but historical figures who are not listed in his document. Now, one of the ways that I'm going to call this a draw is this. And I don't know who discovered this, but I think this is pretty cool. This was the argument for years. But somebody who actually spent time reading Jesus ben Sirach and his writings said, you know what? That's something interesting. In Jesus ben Sirach 36:10, he quotes a prayer. And the prayer looks to be lifted right out of the book of Daniel. The prayer starts out, hasten the day and remember the appointed time, which if you read Daniel 11, looks like it's an exact copy of what Daniel wrote. So if Daniel had not existed, I don't think Jesus ben Sirach could have been lifting a prayer out of it. But you might say that's nebulous and not real firm, but it does cast some doubt and weakens the arguments of the liberal revisionists. Bullet point number 6. We're almost done. Some late daters, and this was I'm going to tell you guys, this is probably one of their most powerful arguments for years that the conservative scholars had difficulty with, because there is an apparent contradiction in the book of Daniel. And then again, thanks to archaeology in the last 50 to 75 years, this is one of the arguments that I told you earlier is turned on its head, and it's now an argument for the 6th century dating. So Daniel goes along and he's in chapter 5 and he calls the king by name. And he calls him Belshazzar. Well, there's a problem. Older archaeologists discovered, prior to 50 to 75 years, 100 years ago, in their digs, they found out that the king at the time Daniel was supposed to have written this was not named Belshazzar. Wasn't even the same guy. This guy's name was Nabonidus. And so this looks like, maybe Daniel isn't a legit book. Maybe it is fraudulently written. He did not know this fact. And by the way, Nabonidus is not mentioned in Daniel. So this looks like a slam dunk. Again, like I said earlier, most of these arguments were made 100 to 120 years ago. Almost all the arguments have been overturned or seriously weakened since then. Secular historians still attribute Daniel to the 2nd century, but now the body of evidence, if you were to put it to a court, the body of evidence definitely says 6th century BC. So here we go. The king that Daniel calls Belshazzar was actually the acting king. And this, again, we did not know this at the time until archaeologists discovered it. Nabonidus was the king, but he was gone away from Babylon for almost 10 years, wars, other missions, but he was literally not home for 10 years. He appointed his son to act as king in his place while he was gone. You know what his son's name was? Belshazzar. You guessed it. Turns out Daniel not only was calling him the correct name, had he not called him King Belshazzar, according to Babylonian court, he was, the way he should have addressed him was king. And what's even further interesting and the nail in the coffin is Daniel himself explains this. You have to read between the lines. Later, Belshazzar and a bunch of his cronies are sitting around getting drunk in a room. And you may remember this from when we studied the book of Daniel. A hand appeared out of thin air and began writing something on the wall that nobody could understand. That's where we get the word, the phrase, the handwriting is on the wall. So this drove everybody nuts. It freaked them out. And Belshazzar made an edict. And here's what he said. To the man who can interpret, this is in Daniel 5:16, black and white. To the man who can interpret the writing on the wall, now remember Belshazzar was only second in command, I will make him the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Now, that little nugget I would have just read over and never connected the dots. Why did he say 3rd highest if he's naming him second in power to him? Because there was one in higher in power than Belshazzar, and that was his dad, Nabonidus, who was absent. So this is one of the arguments that's completely flipped on its head and now become an argument for Daniel's dating in the 6th century. Our argument 7, and I already went over argument 8, I have no response to. Darius the Mede is a Persian king. He is mentioned in Daniel. We've never found one scrap piece, pottery, shard, tablet, fraction of a tablet. We have nothing to extra biblical to support Darius the Mede. My rebuttal to this is very simple. Most of the Bible 150 years ago could not be proven. It is only since archaeology came into place that we've been able to prove anything in the Bible. And since that time, I told you there was an article in Time magazine. It's an older article. It was dated in 1963. They were honoring the man of the year, who they considered to be the most famous archaeologist of all time. And the quote was from the archaeologist, who basically said, and I can actually read you the quote if I have time. Nelson Glueck, Glueck, considered one of the greatest archaeologists of all time, says, and I don't know if this guy's a believer or not, but he said, no archaeological discovery has ever overturned a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or in exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries. So here's item 7. Just because Darius the Mede has never been confirmed extra biblically is not a reason to completely dismiss or flush out the rest of the book, especially considering all the other arguments for it. They're at least watered down by now, or actually have been completely dismissed or utterly overturned in our arguments for a 6th century. I tried to fairly represent the 8 strongest points that liberal revisionists used in the 1800s through the mid 1900s to overturn Daniel, and now historical secular historians now date the book as 2nd century BC. So was Ezekiel. Ezekiel has been completely overturned and now recognized as a 6th century document by both liberal and conservative scholars. I think it's only a matter of time before this happens to the book of Daniel. I have 5 bullet points, very quick, that now I got to give the other guys their side of the story. Here's what conservative theologians would argue. I think the rebuttals are strong enough on their own, but here are the first 5. And the 5 that I'm going to mention of them, 2 of them are not, they're like the 2 arguments, 3 and 8, that I used for the liberal revisionists. They're arguments from a conclusion, and so they're invalid from a debate logical standpoint. But here we go. Argument number 1, New Testament writers and Jesus himself accepted the traditional understanding and the writings of the book of Daniel. And I've got all the scripture references where he was mentioned not only in the gospel accounts, but also in the book of Acts, in book of Hebrews. So if Daniel is a fraud, then this challenges our concept of Jesus as God, because that means Jesus was duped. He was defrauded. He was deceived. He believed Daniel was real, and it wasn't. It was a made up phony book. So that's, but again, a secularist isn't going to care that that's an argument, because he doesn't believe in Jesus anyway. All right, I have something to do, and I'm sorry to have to do this. I've got 3 minutes. I can't finish in 3 minutes. Would you guys take yourselves off mute? Are you okay doing a 3rd micro session that'll last 5 or 10 minutes? Yes or no?
Oh yeah,
Yes.
definitely
Yep.
do it. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Paul's with us, by the way.
It's going to be, 3 videos, because then I can finish my material, but I'm not going to have any time for Q&A. So I apologize. Let's hop off. I'll get to the other bullet points of the conservative scholars, and then we will close. So guys, I'll see you back here in just a couple of minutes.